Hi, and welcome to our webinar today.
I want to remind you that all of this is made possible by your gifts to Presbyterian Sharing. And so thank you very much for supporting that. The other thing I wanted to do is that we have the whole stewardship and plan giving staff joining us today on the webinar for our own information and to help us be part of the conversation. So I'm Karen Plater, and I'm the Associate Secretary for Stewardship and Plan Giving. And we're joined by our Gifts and Database Administrator, Maggie Lewin. So give a wave, Maggie. Great. As well as Jim McDonald, who's the Development Manager, and he's our resident expert in helping churches get onto digital giving. So Jim, give a wave. And then we have Heather Chappell, who is our creative inspiration around the Presbyterian Sharing resources and the educational information on stewardship and Presbyterian Sharing that you see. And I hope that you've checked out her recent children's story, which is animated and is perfect for Plan Giving or Stewardship Sunday. And you can find that online at presbyterian.ca/stewardship. So that's us, but today's all about Lori, and we want to hear from her and learn together. So Lori, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Karen. A practical guide to joyful generosity. I chose this picture of the green kind of wavy hills because I thought maybe this is Jesus sitting on a hill and having a conversation on a beautiful day, and I just wanted to summon that spirit of conversation and calm that this picture means to me. So I pray that whatever circumstances you're in today, that you can get a bit of sitting outdoors or imagining that kind of a situation. I know there's plenty to worry about in the world, but maybe we can give it a break for a little bit. I don't want to talk about me too long. I'm an author, a speaker, and a stewardship coach. I've gone to school for a terribly long time. I'm interruptible, so we're going to have questions throughout because I told Heather when we were chatting beforehand, if I'm not making sense, I'd rather know sooner rather than later. So please don't hesitate to ask questions. I've said these things before and it all makes sense to me, but if it's not clear, please, please, please ask. I am Mennonite, which is why Lori Gunther Reeser is such a long and weird sounding name. I'm a home canner, which is why I get so excited about things like rhubarb. And I'm a quilter. The quilt behind me is actually from the Mennonite Relief Sale in New Hamburg that is going to be happening again this May. And I'm also very excited about that. Last year, almost exactly a year ago now, actually, I published Growing a Generous Church, A Year in the Life of Peach Blossom Church, which is it's not fiction, but it's creative nonfiction about a year in the life of Peach Blossom Church. And you can find out much more about that on my website. It would be perfect for a presbytery book study because it has questions built right in. It's a very accessible and easy to read book. So I recommend that to you. I wanted to start with 3 things that I'm grateful for. And I encourage you to type in the chat what you're grateful for as well. This isn't the exact picture that I saw the other day, but I try to go for at least one walk every day. And I saw a mom with 4 boys. And if you can imagine, like they don't really head in a direction. It's just kind of a lot of energy moving loosely forward. And then the mom was carrying a backpack and she had a backpack on and she's carrying multiple jackets. And then I realized she was also carrying a baby. So she was a very hardworking mom. But it was so joyful to see the whole group of them heading to school and knowing that that is still part of the rhythm of our days. And it made me smile. Another thing I'm thankful for, and you probably saw this in the news as well, this is strollers donated by Polish women and left at the train station so that women arriving from the Ukraine who need a stroller can just get a stroller. So I'm thankful for that kind of generosity in the midst of just horrific circumstances. And lastly, even though Zoom makes us all crazy, I am grateful for Zoom, for technology, so that I can chat with people from Kelowna and Sylvan Lake and wherever the corners of Canada that you're from. I'm glad you're here and I'm glad that we're able to connect. So friends, where are we headed to in this webinar? This is the roadmap. We're going to start with a circle of grace, and that's a way of thinking theologically about money. Because if we think of money as something separate from our faith, then we're sure going to have a hard time talking about it. If we can make money part of our faith discussion, it's going to make everything else easier. So we'll start there. Then we'll look at an offering prayer, because that's something that I hope happens every week, and it's just an easy place to start. So we're going to look at offering prayers. From there, we're going to go into thank you letters, because I discovered when I was working on this webinar that a thank you letter is really just an offering prayer that starts out with dear name. It's very, very similar. You can do one, you can do the other. So that's where we're going to go from that link. And then once we can talk about money a little bit more with more ease, we might even be able to talk to our church treasurer. Maybe you're the church treasurer, and then these are some of the things you could look at yourself, but different ways that we might questions that we might use in our discussion. And as I said, just please put type in the chat if you've got a question or something, please let me know. The Circle of Grace giving model, this picture here with the peach is from my book. It's Peach Blossom Church after all, so there's a lot of fruit in the book. And this illustration is the Circle of Grace model, which is used quite often in the book, and I wanted to show you, make that connection for you. But for the purposes of this webinar, I'm going to be using this model that you see in front of you here with the boxes for God and people and people. No peach, but it's easier to see on the screen. When I was putting this slides together, the lectionary text was Genesis 15. And I always try to use the lectionary when I'm working on something like this so that I don't just pick my favorite passages, because if this model of giving is going to work, it should work with a variety of texts. So the text, Genesis 15, if you're maybe you don't know that one off the top of your head, I didn't, but it's Abraham and God, or Abram at this point, maybe having a chat and saying, I don't have any descendants, so this promise, that I'm going to have descendants like stars in the sky, God, I'm not sure how that's going to go down. That's not going to work. I don't have any actual kids. And God says, Abraham, just you have to have some faith that you're going to have lots of descendants and that I do fulfill my promises. So if you think about the grace that God is promising to Abraham, and Abraham is going to have gracious action, he's going to be able to be the parent of many, many children, and then he's going to rejoice and thank God for everything that has happened to him and his family. So that's just one way of looking at the model. Now, too often, I'm afraid, in churches, we just look at, instead of realizing that every good thing comes from God, including our money, including our resources, when we do have the financial discussion, we're kind of terrified, and we just talk about people giving to the budget. This is not terribly inspiring, and it just takes the grace of God and the opportunity to praise God for everything we've been given right out of it, and makes it about budget, and also takes it about, instead of people helping people, we remove that human connection, and we make, a budget isn't really, it's not a strong theological or warm personal reason to give. We can do better, and we have the theology to do better. So I'm going to go through this diagram, because if we just have the budget, what are we all losing? You can see a big red X. When we talk about giving my money away, my money, it's all me. God didn't give me that money, mine. And it's so easy for us to do that. It's so easy for us to do that when we're scared. And I think if we're honest, we're all feeling a little fearful and anxious these days, and we want to hold on super tight. If we realize that it's what God has given us, that we can share, and that it's like a rhubarb plant, that if we give our rhubarb away, the rhubarb is going to grow more rhubarb. It's not a zero-sum game, that God gives us grace every single day. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. Never, even on bad days. If we can remember that, and remember that it's what we're sharing, what God has given us, it makes it so much easier to share. It's not our stuff. So that's the side of the model that I want us to remember, is remembering that everything we have, every good thing, is a gift from God. And I know that that takes more effort some days than others. And that's why I rejoice in the small, the small, the small moments of joy, just to remind myself that God is still on the job. The other thing, when we just focus on people giving money to the budget, when we leave God out of the picture, we also neglect an opportunity to say thank you to God. And that's something we're going to talk about in this webinar a whole lot, is how to say thank you to God for the gifts that we receive, that gifts that we receive individually and the gifts that we receive as a congregation. If your church is still here, friends, you have something to be rejoicing about. If your church has died and been reborn as a new kind of faith community, you have something to rejoice about too. So we have a lot of opportunities to praise God, and we want to use every single one, as many as we can. I know these are tough times for a lot of churches. The pandemic has just been a hard slog. This is a blog that I actually published in 2015. I've been doing this for a bit now, and I've changed it a little bit to reflect the pandemic. I think it still works. It's 3 things that a church can always be thankful for. The first is God. I know this is obvious, but we have to be reminded of the obvious things, at least I do, quite often. So God doesn't change. God's faithful today. God is faithful next Tuesday, next week, next year. God is still faithful. We can still rejoice in that, no matter what else is changing in our lives and in our congregation. God's faithfulness has not changed. Worship is another thing that a church can always be thankful for. Even if you were gathering by phone or on Zoom or in the parking lot or online or however you were doing it, your church continued to worship God. And that is something to be exceedingly thankful for. Some churches, I'm sure, that are on this call have really long histories. You could be around, I mean, this might not even be your first pandemic. So that's another thing to rejoice in, is the history of the church and all that you've been through together and that God has led you through. Lastly, and this isn't an exhaustive list, of course, there's more than 3 things to be grateful for, but I give you this as sort of a starter. Hope. Hope does not disappoint us. That's what Paul, the Apostle Paul, says. God is faithful. We can worship and we are not alone. We have hope. So if you're thinking, oh, our congregation has 10 people and we're a 3-point charge, all of these things still apply. If your congregation has 200 people, you are thankful for all of these things as well. And you can add more things to this list, and they'd be even more meaningful when it's something specific to your context that you're grateful for. So if you have something you're grateful for in your congregation, go ahead and type it in. It'll be good for you just to name it, and it'll be good for the rest of us to see it. So I encourage you at any point during the webinar, think, oh, I'm really grateful that our food bank is still going, or that we still pray on Tuesdays. Please share. Okay, an offering prayer. We have a weekly opportunity to talk to God, first of all, and to talk to our congregation about the offering. And here's a moment to bless our congregation, to be grateful to them, to bless God, and to explain to people too what happens when you share, what happens when the offering. I shared earlier our story of Abraham and the stars in the sky and God making the promise and saying, I know things look dark right now, but look up to the stars. This is how many descendants you're going to have. And so it's stories like that. And every text, every week has opportunities for us to look just a little bit beyond our moment and remember what we're grateful for in the past, what we look forward to in the future, and those moments in our church that are happening now that we can be grateful for. If you have something that if you have a situation in your church that you would like to share and you would like to say, okay, Lori, this is our text or this is our congregation. How could I make this into an offering prayer? I'm very open to, working on that together right now. If you want to type it in, I'll leave it to Heather to read out because I can't look quite at everything at the same time. But if there's something that you would like a little nudge with about how to create an offering prayer, I'm very open to doing that now.
We're a small group. Grace, if you want to unmute people, somebody could just share. Or if people can unmute themselves.
Yeah, people have the ability to unmute themselves. If they...
You could unmute yourself if you've got something you'd like to share, rather than typing it in.
And if you're shy, that's okay too. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I do want to, maybe sometimes it's harder than others. You think, oh, but our congregation is very small. What do we have to be grateful for?
Well, we have some people who have put in what they're grateful for, Lori. So dedication of our volunteers, grateful that our givings have actually increased over the last 2 years. And another is grateful that they still have a Sunday school.
Oh, yes. Yeah, those are all wonderful things, like to say, I thank God for the faithful givers to St. Andrews. Our ministry is able to continue, and it's not just Sunday worship that you're seeing. You know that we are grateful that we still have a Sunday school program. And when you contribute to St. Andrews, you're helping the next generation of disciples grow in this place, and we're so grateful. There's an offering that to me would be a wonderful start to an offering prayer. And just to remember the things in your church that are, that are happening that aren't necessarily on Sunday morning as well. And they don't have to be big things. They can be small, real things. If you're able to phone seniors, if you're able to have a ministry of a prayer chain, all kinds of things are happening, or people phone the church. All those connections are important. And to say, this is the ministry that we do together with the grace of God. And thank you for your generous support.
I was thinking for the one who said grateful for the dedication of our volunteers, that your prayer could include, we are thankful for the gifts that people have given, particularly the gifts of time and talent, which help multiply the financial gifts we've gathered here on our plates. Because of their contributions, you are doing even more than we could imagine. Or
right.
More than we could imagine together.
Right. And that's straight out of anything more that we can ask. I don't know if it's Ephesians or Corinthians, but yeah, that's lovely.
Ephesians, we've been using it a lot.
And we have another, grateful for the volunteers in our church, the vision and willingness to see change as a positive thing, our little group of prayer angels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So all of those real, genuine thank yous, just to remind people, because we can't assume that everyone got the memo that they know what happens when you give the offering or why. So the more we can tell grateful stories, it's part of our worship, really, to thank God for what we're able to do together. All right. Oh, look at that. I led myself into the next slide without even knowing it. So stories are just a wonderful way. I mean, the Bible is full of stories of our gracious action, our volunteers, our Sunday school teachers, the people who shovel the snow. I guess there's no snow shoveling stories in the Bible, but you know what I mean? Like, there's so many ways to recognize and acknowledge the gifts that are given and received in a church. And stories is just a wonderful way to do that. So I think the offering is an excellent moment to acknowledge some stories of the gracious action that we receive and that we're able to share. So thank you letters, like as I said, it's just really an offering prayer. Well, I was going to say with a stamp, but not necessarily with a stamp. It could be an email these days or in a church mailbox or whatever. But once we're able to have our grateful heart and look at our church and think of some of the stories and the ways that God is present and the way that people are sharing financially and their time and their energy, all of those things. We can maybe even keep a diary, like a gratitude journal for your, and then when a thank you letter will be, you'll have lots of good material. I'm going to start with a bit of a cautionary tale, which is a true story that I'm sharing with permission, of a woman whose mother-in-law passed away. And that this woman didn't attend church, but her mother-in-law did. And so her and her husband made a $25,000 gift to the church, to her mother-in-law's church, in her mother-in-law's memory. And all they got back, unfortunately, was a form letter. It wasn't even signed. It was a receipt, which was incorrect because it was from a donor-advised fund. And the one making the gift said it just felt like a bucket of cold water. And so I mean, it's more than a sad story. It's a ministry opportunity lost that would have been a way to connect with this woman and say, you know, we so appreciate the memory of your mother-in-law in this church, and we're so grateful for her life and for the gift you made in her honor. So I shared this story a couple of weeks ago, and someone said, oh, that happened to me. And the good news of that is that this woman worked for her, in this case, it was a parish, and said, you know, I was able to make some changes. And now when someone makes a memorial gift in our congregation, they get a letter, you know, thanking for the gift, and it's personal and it's respectful. So I'm really glad to hear stories like that. Not to hear the stories where it's unrespectful, but where people have been able to make a change is very encouraging. This picture here with the people throwing the crutches in the air and stuff is the story of the 10 lepers, where 10 are healed, but only one comes back to say thank you. And I sometimes wonder if that's the church, in that we are just not the one coming back to say thank you, but we can do that. We can learn to put our gratefulness into words and onto paper. So a thank you letter is like an offering prayer, but with a signature or a stamp or an email or whatever it is. But it's once you can do an offering prayer, you can write a thank you letter. The essential elements to a thank you letter, you'll be pleased to know that in my mind, grammar and punctuation do not count. I mean, I guess you want to be moderately respectful, but it just has to be a real thing. It has to be personal, it has to be grateful, and it has to be signed by an actual person. And people ask me who that should be, and I say, well, not me, because I don't know these people, but whoever makes sense, that someone who's receiving the letter would know that person, whether it's a clergy or whether it's someone that's known in the church. You'll be able to discern that. So that's, I just want to, I hope that this is a low bar for a thank you letter, and it doesn't have to be long, it doesn't have to be formal, just has to be a real thing.
Here's a good question that's coming on the chat, Lori. How do you maintain arm's length with someone who gives and with who gives what and send thank you letters? So does that make sense?
It does. I would stake out the somewhat controversial position that you don't necessarily need to maintain arm's length. That if you trust your clergy to be at the person's bedside as they die, or with them as they get out of prison, or they get the cancer diagnosis, that you can trust your clergy to with the amount or the knowledge of that person is a financial giver. And when you are able to make that, when the clergy is able to know that information, they're also able to do things like, I had a question in a webinar like this where someone said, should I ask my dying church member for a bequest? And I thought, oh, that's so, like, ideally you would like to have that conversation a little bit earlier. And so when the clergy does have access to that information, they're able to have some really wonderful conversations like, thank you, like before the funeral, a thank you on this side of the grave, which is, it's just a wonderful blessing for both the clergy and for the person receiving that acknowledgement. So I know that's not answering your question, because I'm saying I don't think you need to have that arm's length. If that's something that you do want to maintain, then you would just have a letter that doesn't say the amount. That would be one way to do it. Or for that to be a separate acknowledgement tucked in after it's been signed.
Does that answer the question? Anyone else have a thought on that?
I'm the writer of that question. We've been very diligent about only the envelope steward knowing exactly what people are giving. I mean, I see transfers and this and that, but I never see the big picture as treasurer. And it's quite important that that's what we've done, but maybe we're not, and I don't know how we could change minds on that. And I worry about everybody knowing, I just don't know how to deal with that in a different way. So it's thought-provoking.
Yes, it is. I mean, especially the longer when that pattern is very familiar, it's difficult, isn't it? I would say that having only one person who knows that gives a lot of power to that person. And then that secrecy and the privacy around giving gives money, I think, more power than it really deserves. Because then we can assume, like, I wasn't going to go into sort of some of the darker aspects of church giving here, but we will have people who will threaten to stop giving, but maybe they don't really give that much. So the secrecy and silence around giving gives a lot of power to the person who knows, and then it leaves some things to the imagination that might not be true.
Gail, you had did you have a comment you wanted to make or a thought? The other Gail?
The other Gail?
Hi.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, as clergy, I actually don't want to know what people give. I never want to know what people give. I'm happy to know that someone supports the ministry and mission of the church, but I never want to know if they are giving $100 a year or if they're giving, 20,000 in the year. I just don't want that to ever come into play in my thinking. And I mean, I don't think it would, but hey, I'm human. I don't know. That's just my perspective on it.
Oh,
And
yes. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Gail. I've definitely heard that one before. I think this is like addressing about a whole nother slide deck that I have. My thinking on that one is that giving is a spiritual discipline like prayer. And in fact, Jesus addresses it in the same passage as like the whole left hand, right hand story is about prayer. Like we should pray in our closet and we should keep our giving secret. And then the church says, oh, well, we still need to pray in church, or how are we going to learn to pray? So I'm a believer in as much transparency and openness as we can. So at least knowing who gives would be an opportunity to say thank you to a longtime giver, again, on this side of the grave rather than after. And if giving is a spiritual discipline like prayer, which I believe it is, then we have an opportunity to help people with those spiritual disciplines. We would, I think, in any congregation be very delighted to help someone learn to pray. And so too, not everyone got the memo about generosity. A lot of the most generous people learned from their parents, but that was in a different time, in a different place, when when cash was king. And so the more we can talk about our generosity, the more we can help people in the spiritual discipline of giving as a discipleship question. And that's why I feel that the more we can talk about it, the better, because it's a discipleship question. And I realize that not everyone is going to land on the same place, but as long as we can do whatever we can to encourage people to be generous.
And I think sometimes it's good for our sessions to grapple with this and ask, who is it to know? So maybe it's not just the one offering secretary, and maybe it's not the minister knowing exactly how much, but there can be things like, this is our team, and then we're going to be pastoral and look at encouraging generosity and saying thank you and being responsible. So I think you really need to look at the nature of your congregation. And as Lori said, be really open and transparent, especially if you're making a change. Like you don't want to suddenly go for, oh, we've decided that we should know everything. And so suddenly everybody knows everything. And then people are, what? We've always been like, so, and get people on board with sort of, oh, is this something to share? And then you can also have people opt out. Like people can say, I want to give anonymously. That can be like an option. And then you'll know, oh, they want to give anonymously, so that's fine. And we find that some people do want to give. But so it's a good conversation starter, and it would be a good topic about why do we have this? What's it accomplishing in our church? Is it still? You can be pretty sure that when people are giving to the Cancer Society, when they're giving to the hospital or the education, that principals and presidents and stuff are knowing about who is supporting their organization. And so they will thank you, and people will just assume that whether they're a good supporter or a non-supporter. And so if you're deciding I don't want to, let people know that that's intentional, that you don't know anything, but there are people at the church who do, or what's the culture at your church, and have the conversation. And because then you'll find some people might be, oh no, I would like to, and I'd like to actually talk to you about how my gifts could make a difference in this congregation, and you as viewed as the leader. So how do you see that if I wanted to make a big or large significant gift to the congregation, how would it be used? Would it be used well? You know, people need to be able to feel they can have that conversation with you or with
Exactly. Yeah.
leadership.
The other, again, this could be a whole another slide deck here, is I vividly remember having a conversation with a church treasurer who said that she was the only person who knew when someone was about to leave the church, because the money goes first. Money stops first and then the person. So a sudden change in giving patterns could be a sign that someone is just about to be divorced and leave the church. So it's a real pastoral care moment too. So there's a lot to consider. Anyway, that wasn't going to be the focus here, but thank you for the question. It's really important that we have a space for these kind of honest questions, because it's about money, it's about our faith, it's about faith formation, it's about pastoral care. It's never just about money. It's about a lot of things. And sometimes
I'll
Go
just
ahead,
throw
Karen.
in, this will get us back on track because I think you'll answer it quite. Could you have a personal letter ready for each donor that would go out with the annual receipts?
Oh, please. Oh, please. I beg you. I implore you to do. You know how I was going to answer that one, Karen. Yes, we're coming up to that actually. So, yes, I have some very practical resources to help you do that. It is, yeah. If I can go to my grave and the one thing I accomplished, that more churches send out thank you letters with their receipts, I'm hoping that's going to get me through. Okay, so this is a sample thank you letter that I wrote to answer my little story about the woman not getting a gift, not getting a letter for the gift in memory of her mother. This doesn't mean you have to use this letter, but sometimes it's easier to change something than it is to write your own. So I offer this for your consideration. And thinking again of what a ministry opportunity is when a grandson makes a memory gift in grandma's name. That might be his only interaction with the church. So we have a real ministry opportunity and a way to connect with people. Never mind being a good steward of the gift and a good steward of that grandson. The next one is another slide, just what a thank you letter might look like. St. Andrew's seems to cover off a lot of Presbyterian churches, so I put that name in there. And again, another way of looking at being grateful, gratitude is not constrained by time or space. Thinking back to the history of the church, people who prayed the community into existence and whose prayers surround us still. I think that could be an offering prayer as well, actually. I thank God for faithful donors like you. I swipe these things from the Apostle Paul. That's if you think back to our circle of grace model. I mean, you can say I thank you as well. That's totally fine. But I thank God for you is reminding us of who the giver of all these good things really is. Praise God for our continued worship together. Yeah, a God who multiplies our efforts. That's what Karen was saying just a few minutes ago. And again, this letter doesn't have to, make the letter sound like you. Make it sound like your congregation in language that makes sense in your context. That's what's important. There's no right or there's no formal tone that's required. But maybe you're very formal. Maybe formal would be right. But what I'm saying is trust that you know your congregation and what's needed. This, I know this letter is linked on the Presbyterian website. It is my most popular blog of all time. Thank you letters for people who didn't give, because I think they should get a letter too. Yeah, so I'm a big proponent of gratitude. And the church has an opportunity to be a good role model. If you look for this graphic on my blog as well, it's part of a 3-part series called the ABCs, the Annual Blessing of Charitable Receipts. So there's 3 parts, and the part 3 is about a thank you letter. You don't have to, you can write it down, but the blog is there and the slides are there as well. I thank God for your generosity. Start with that. And these are all lines from the blog, but I'm putting them out there just to get the language, just to, sometimes if you hear it, you think, oh, I could say that, or I would say it this way. And this is, that's the whole point of the webinar, is just to get us thinking about how we might incorporate joyful generosity, how we might nurture joyful generosity in our church. So here are some starting lines. I praise the Lord for the generous gifts people gave too. I thank God for your gift to St. Andrews. It's a blessing and encouragement to know that you care about this ministry. Thank you for your prayerful support of. They're all very similar, but they're grateful, and that's the main thing. I have a colleague in the United States called Rebecca Basinger, who wrote Growing Givers' Hearts, Treating Fundraising as Ministry about 20 years ago. And she is my inspiration. It's no coincidence that the title of my book and the title of her book sound kind of similar. And she read my blog and added these lines, which I think are really wonderful. If you're doing your thank you letter with your annual receipt, you could do a lot worse than just borrowing these two sentences, which are shared with permission. Thanks to the generosity of God's people, Grace Church was able to, and then put the ministry highlights here, have a Sunday school, buy a new camera for our hybrid worship, or whatever it was that you were able to do. Thank you for reflecting God's generosity by being a volunteer, by giving to the food bank, by praying on our Wednesday night prayer group, by volunteering to help with, you get the picture. All of those things that you're grateful for, you just have to compile them here, and you have a thank you letter or an offering prayer. Is there any other questions that you wanted to ask about thank you letters or about offering prayers before I shift gears a little bit? Or anything else for that matter that's related to the topic?
And anyone can unmute yourself if you just want to pop in with a voice question.
What do you mean by ask the same questions for multiple years?
Oh, I haven't got, just hold on. I'll get to that when I do this slide. Sorry, I should have maybe backed up for the questions there. Okay. So three questions that you could ask your church finance team or your treasurer. And if you come up with a question, I can circle back. So don't feel like that opportunity has passed you by. 3 questions to ask your finance team, or whatever language applies best in your situation, is how much do people give? And that's typically what people keep track of, although sometimes it's just the total income. And I would really want to know, is some of that rental income, or is that some of that from our endowment fund? How much of it is actually from receipted giving from individuals? So if that's...
And are you also interested in average and median gifts, like sort of the largest gifts, if it's not specific to people? Is that type of thing helpful?
Yeah, that's the advanced course, Karen. But yes, yes, because typically the giving is going to be really concentrated. I mean, I don't know if I have it on this slide or not, but oh yeah, I do. It's coming up. Is your church 2 or 3 funerals away from disaster? Look at the biggest gifts and look how old those people are.
Yeah, it's a very different story, isn't it? If your church, say, gets $100,000 and 3 people are giving $70,000, versus if it's $100,000 and it's from 100 families who are giving $1,000 each.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. And even just looking at the top couple of givers and how old they are and how much, it's like, should we just let I can assure you that the hospital and the Cancer Society are asking for bequests. So it's up to you whether that's how you want it to go, or whether if the church wants to ask. But yeah, it's here again, looping back to our previous discussion, silence isn't real helpful here. People are not just, some people, bless their heart, might give you a bequest without being asked, but if they think that the church is just going to argue about the money, then no, it seems unlikely. So I guess a more positive way of saying that is, if you look at this and realize that the people are older, the biggest donors are older, you have an opportunity now to talk about a legacy gift to give faith. You have been a faithful donor to St. Andrews for 50 years. Would you like that legacy of generosity to continue in the future? Can you continue to bless this congregation that you care about into the future with a gift in your will? It's an opportunity to have that conversation. You should be having that conversation anyway, but maybe looking at these numbers will give an impetus to that conversation. Look at how did people give? Did they give by, I know in my congregation, electronic giving is now the vast majority of gifts. And so, Jim, I can't see you, but bless your heart for setting up all those websites. You really want to look at that. I mean, there's nothing wrong with giving by a check, but look at how people give, and that's something that you can mention during worship as well. As we are, maybe you're passing the plate now. We're thankful to the people who are putting money or a check or an envelope into the offering plate, but we also want to remember the people who are giving through the pre-authorized giving, and we're thankful for the people who, who are giving electronically, et cetera, to acknowledge all those forms of generosity.
One of the interesting things that came out when we did the treasurer's webinar was just how people are giving differently, and it's forced some of the bookkeeping and treasurers to think about how the money comes in, because before it was the majority came in the offering plate and they had a very specific way of how they dealt with it. You'd have 2 counters and it would get deposited immediately. And so they had to think outside the box when suddenly they were dealing with e-transfers and online donors and monthly givers and people giving through Canada Helps. And it's just like, it demonstrated so quickly how opening the doors to people to give just allows people to give even more. And I love the story. Somebody had wanted to give to a congregation through our website, the national website. And we were like, well, no, you should give through the congregation. We don't really have the capacity to channel gifts to congregations. We do that for gifts of securities because they're complicated, but it would overwhelm our systems to do that. And so when we contacted the treasurer, they said, oh yeah, well, we just do e-transfers because we don't want to do online giving. That's too much. We don't want to do, so we just tell people e-transfers. Well, the person who wanted to give hadn't been to that congregation in years. They were wanting to give because they had gone when they were younger and then they moved away. So they didn't have the email to do an e-transfer. They wanted to support the congregation monthly. So they wanted to sign up for a monthly gift. And so then Jim helped walk the congregation through, well, you already have Canada Helps. So just put the button to Canada Helps on your website and they can then go and they can give the monthly gift and they, don't have to have that connection. And it's just like, you're just opening the door. It may cost a little more because you have to pay a bit of percentage to Canada Helps, but you wouldn't get that gift otherwise. And there's lots of people in the community and stuff who might not have the inside of the to do an Interact e-transfer, which is a wonderful way to give, very economical. It's great for the majority of your donors, but it's just like, oh, how do we open these doors so that the people we don't even know about, that God has planted on their heart to support your ministry, make it easy for them.
Yes, the Presbyterian Church in the United States, this is a year or two ago, they released some numbers on online giving, and they say, like, if you have $40 cash on a Sunday, you're going to give 20 because you need $20 for lunch the next day. If you make electronic gift, the number they cited was $160. So even if you have to pay 3%, and Canada Helps is a wonderful, worthy charity anyway. They're issuing their receipts for you. They're making it easy that you don't have to worry about the tech. As you do, I encourage Canada Helps. It's wonderful.
And it's already set up. So even if you want to later explore other options like Tidely and that, you can get going with Canada Helps right away because it's already set up. Your congregation's already listed on it.
Yes, yeah, it's by far and away the easiest, I think. So the questions I've got here are: how much did people give? How did they give? Like what method, and how many receipts? That's interesting to know because you could have a small number of people. Then the trends, in fact, in Canada are that fewer donors are giving more. So you're even if your giving is going up, it could be just that it's a few people who are really exceedingly generous, and you would want to know that. So I think did your $100,000 come from 15 people or 30 is a really important question. And so that's where and this is circling back, thanks for your patience for who asked this, the same questions for multiple years. How many people gave last year? How many receipts did you give last year? How many receipts did you give this year? Well, that will tell you something. I don't think you have to go back forever because things have changed so much that data from 10 years ago is just nostalgia at this point. It doesn't really matter, but it is interesting to go back a year or two to see, are people giving more? Are people giving less? And how many people are giving, or how many households are giving? So just the number of receipts is a really important question to know. So how did that land? Is there something I said too fast that you wanted me to go back over, or do you say, or you want to say, I don't think so? It's totally fine to. I welcome feedback of all kinds.
I'm going back to question 1. How much did people give? Are we truly asking like how much did individuals give? Is that what or is it more trending, or what do you mean by that?
No, that's good. Yeah, you're right that's a vague question. I was looking at the overall sum, but it would be interesting, as we were talking about more informally, to look at amounts, like just take all your receipt amounts, put them in Excel. You probably have them in Excel anyway. Sort them largest to smallest, and see what that tells you. But yeah,
so not specifics, not people, but just this is now she's talking just as statistics. If what type of information is good for the session to know, they could know how much did people give, and you could say, by how many people, and then you could say, oh, and here's the average gift, here's the median gift, and the median means that less. If you've got 100 people giving and 50 gave 25, then anyway.
Half gave more, half gave less. Yeah,
And the stair step graph too, right? Of giving by category.
Yes, that can be very interesting. Like so many gave, up to $500. So many gave between 500 and 2,000. And decide what categories are useful to you.
Yeah, and you don't have to have it. You don't have to have everything perfect the first time. It's just good to get the conversation started. Even knowing how many receipts is a very interesting question to have, because you say, 37 receipts. That's very interesting because there's 100 people or whatever there is. And it's just like, it's good to know. I mean, it might be uncomfortable to know at a certain point, but we're the church and we can talk about hard things. And we can also, when we're having this discussion, if we can, in our best days, I think Lord help us to be generous would maybe be the prayer to start with, but to remember to have a grateful conversation about the offering, to be a good model of stewardship, and to be a gracious receiver and a grateful receiver. Once we have that in our mind, we can unclench a little bit, and it makes these conversation and these questions not quite so uncomfortable. I mean, it's still going to be, if we haven't talked about it in a while, it's still going to take some bravery, but we can do it.
I think it was we were at a church together, Lori, and there was somebody on session who kind of confessed. She says, I don't know how much I should be giving. And then when the minister said, yeah, I've never preached on stewardship, and even just the principles about how and why do we give, and what does the scriptures teach about giving. And we do have resources on that, just things that teach about it. It's not about what's the budget and do I think I can contribute to the budget. It's about what has God given you and how can I give back to God, and what are different ways that I can do that. So it can be proportional, look at your income and you can say how you do this and see where God's speaking. So they'd never talked about it. And this woman who'd been going to church her whole life really sort of said, I don't know how much I should be giving. And so that was sort of a little bit eye-opening, I think, for everyone.
Yeah, we can't assume that people got the memo. And if we can approach it as giving is a spiritual discipline like prayer, it's something that we do individually. We pray individually, we pray together. Same thing with giving. If we're encouraged to pray regularly, and same thing with giving, that's 1 Corinthians 16, we're encouraged to give regularly. But there's also going to be times like there's a war in Ukraine and we're going to give some extra giving, and we're also going to pray extra. It's funny how those two things go together. There's going to be opportunities for spontaneous prayer and spontaneous generosity. just as we're encouraged to to pray regularly and to give regularly. So yeah, there's so much opportunity for our faith to be enriched by talking about our generosity and by talking it in the context of our faith. Especially, I use prayer as an example a lot just because it links up so nicely. Yeah, once we can do that, once we can realize that this is part of our faith and this is part of our discipleship, then it makes these kinds of questions less scary. I think I've already dealt with these. Did your church rely on rental income, endowment funds? Just to know. And again, the secrecy on this doesn't really help. You know, where's the church at? And just looking at the concentration of giving, a lot of the gifts coming from the largest gifts coming from older donors, and an opportunity to have a grateful conversation on this side of the grave is something that I'm a big fan of. Fan isn't the right word, but the testimony of a faithful giver, someone that has supported Knox Presbyterian since 1962, that the video of that person and why they support the church is the best stewardship sermon that will ever be preached. People will remember it. People will cry. God will be glorified. And I should have started with that. But the opportunity to ask someone why they're generous and why they care about the church, and for that testimony to be shared, wow, it's.
And I think your question, how old are your biggest donors? It's not even. It's just how few are your biggest donors, or how much is your budget dependent on one or two donors? Because, you know, people get hit by cars or struck down by illness, and your biggest donor may be 45 and they could pass away unexpectedly too. So it's like, is our church really dependent on a few people who are giving a lot, or have we, you know, built a nice solid base of givers, and we'd be able to withstand, you know, continue ministry no matter what happens?
Right. Are we nurturing discipleship in our congregation across the board? Are we teaching our children? Are we teaching our young adults? And we shouldn't assume that we know that the other generations got the generosity memo either.
And I think it's important to tell the story, if you've got endowments or other investment, of how and why those were built up, and that people had given to continue and encourage the ministry that we do. And this helps multiply the gifts that you do. But how you tell that story of sort of rental income or investment income can also impact how people give as well. You don't want, and this is all tied in, that we're not giving to pay the church budget, we're giving to do God's ministry. And God has bigger dreams for us. If we manage to meet our full budget, we've got ideas and things that we can do. So keep on giving. Like, don't ever be worried that you're going to give us too much.
Absolutely, yes. The vision for the church is much bigger than survival. Mm-hmm. Yes. So this is just kind of recalling the roadmap of where we've been. We talked about the Circle of Grace model of giving, which is I always use, because we need to remember that it's all God stuff, that we are just stewards of what God has entrusted to us to share with other people, and to thank God for the opportunities we have to receive and the opportunities we have to give. And offering prayer is just remembering that God is at the center of it. The remembering the circle of grace is, and thanking God for what we've received, thanking God, you know, it's, once we have that, once we're able to, you know, move beyond people budget, the offering prayer is pretty straightforward, I think. Thank you letter is an offering prayer that starts off with dear name. I think we had more than 3 questions for our church treasurer, so I thank you for everyone that was so honest about saying what your church situation is and what your joys and concerns are. I'm grateful for that. This is me. I am often hesitant to explain what I do, but I don't know why that is. If you're looking for a speaker, a preacher at your church, and I've got a couple of I'm preaching to real people in the church next month. I'm very excited about that, a couple times. So if you're looking for a speaker, please keep me in mind. Or if you need some coaching at your church, what are we going to do for planned giving, or what are we, you looking forward, what are we going to do? I'd be very happy to be involved there. Board meetings are a specialty. Book clubs. Oh, I've done that in the wrong order. Well, I'll talk about the book next. And generosity assessments, which is just like the 3 questions for the church treasurer, but done with a bit more depth, and also looking at congregational values, looking at what your church is grateful for, because then you know what the stories are, what the values are, and what people, that connects to giving in a really big way. So that generosity assessment is something that we did with the PCC a couple of years ago, and that's still an option for your congregation, just to kind of move, can't see the forest for the trees kind of thing. It helps to have someone come that's not part of the congregation to get that discussion started. I got my book, Growing a Generous Church, A Year in the Life of Peach Blossom Church. There's I think there's a video on it on the PCC website, but as I said, it's got the Circle of Grace figures prominently, and it literally is a year in the life. There's a chapter for February with a guy with a snowblower. There's a chapter for September. There's questions for each month, so it makes it really easy to do a book club. I'm going to be via Zoom with a book club in Saskatchewan next month. I'm excited about that. And just as a tip, what they've done is they're doing it by seasons. So there's 4 seasons in a year. So they've divided the chapters up into groups, into 4 groups. And I'm going to be the guest speaker for the last session. So I'm excited about that. So if you'd like to order the book, there's a discount for book clubs. And if you're anybody in Winnipeg, if you're in Winnipeg, you can buy the book at an actual bookstore. So I'll put that out there. Yeah, and there's a deal for the book club. It's all on my website. That's exactly how much it is. If your church doesn't have a credit card, just send me a note and we'll figure it out. I can do direct e-transfers, and I can do checks too. I try to practice what I preach. So thank you. I appreciate having a good discussion and some back and forth and some questions. And I'm going to turn it back over to Karen.
We do have a thank you, Lori. Corinne says, thank you. I have some concrete things to take to our session to make us more gracious and nurture discipleship.
Oh, yay.
And I'll thank you once again for joining us, Lori. We always appreciate doing webinars with you. We are looking forward to announcing shortly some more stewardship and treasurer webinars. Then we're working on a plan and map for the next year so that we give you more notice when these are happening. But we've just mostly been, whenever we get a good idea, we're just like, oh, let's do it. And so you've been good practice for us. But we'll be hopefully offering more in the future and get these to be regular so you know that they're coming. Again, if you want to join us next week to look at annual stewardship resources, Bruce Barkhauer is going to introduce to us their program from Cup and Bread to Faith and Giving. And I think it's just a very practical way to apply many of the things that we've been talking about today with Lori. Whether you use that annual resource or not, it'll give you ideas. How do you introduce some of these themes in your congregation? And we're also offering to all Presbyterian congregations the free digital download. So we've got a coupon code for you. You could go and download the digital resources for free. So be sure to take advantage of that. Otherwise, we hope we'll see some of you next week at 2 p.m. or via email or Zoom, or perhaps maybe even in person in the near future. Thanks for joining us.